So just I'd like to start with a definition of inflation. Inflation is basically a general increase in the prices of goods and services over time. I think most people know what it means. They see the rise of prices, of groceries, of their energy bills, and what have you, and they deem that to be inflation, which is correct. Do you want to add anything there to the definition? Or
Yes, the as you said, the inflation, as viewed from the point of view of the consumer, is a persistent rise in prices of goods over a period of time. There will be many causes of it. Generally, the economists would call it a situation of too much money chasing too few goods, and that could be because
that's demand pull. That's demand pull inflation.
Well, I would disagree. It is a case of too much money chasing too few goods in all eventualities, whether that's because we have too much money in the economy and therefore the sellers can charge more for their products, or whether it's because goods are scarce and therefore people are happy to throw more money at it.
But what you've just mentioned are two different forms of inflation. One of them is called demand pull, which is lots of money chasing too few goods, and the other one is supply-driven inflation, where there is either scarcity of goods, for various reasons there might be scarcity. Just two different types of inflation, or two different causes of inflation there. One is
yes, but in both cases, it's a case of too much money chasing too few goods.
Well, if you look it up online, you'll notice the demand pull inflation.
What you're saying, I understand about demand pull and cost push, but both of those are manifestations of too much money chasing too few goods. That's so
not necessarily. If you have a supply shortage, that's not necessarily because there's a lack of demand. That's also not necessarily because there's too much money. The supply might not be available because, let's say, the shipping routes have been disrupted for whatever reason.
Yes.
So that could be. It could just be the case that there's scarcity of land.
No, I think you've misunderstood it there, because if there is a scarcity of an item, people would be happy to pay more to get it because there's a lot of competition for it. So it's still a case of too much money chasing too few goods.
No, I disagree. I disagree. I think you're conflating the two sides, demand and supply, into one. I don't think that's necessarily the case. No, you can have a finite.
No, I'm not saying
you can have a finite amount of money and still have supply-driven inflation.
We're talking about money in the hands of the consumer rather than money as an aggregate quantity that is in existence in a particular country. So it is. I stand by my definition, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but it's not too much money chasing too few goods in that case. So if you
have, it would be, because you can only charge for an item what people are prepared to pay for it. Otherwise, you might as well close your shop. So if people are prepared to pay more, either because they have a lot of money or because the item is scarce, then it's a case of too much money chasing too few goods, and that is the underlying cause of inflation.
Okay, so what's the cause of the energy crisis and its effect on the cost of people's energy bills? People are not going out there going, oh yeah, I'm going to go and pay more for my energy, and therefore, that is the consumer's desire to spend more to acquire something of that is scarce. It isn't. It's been driven by the fact that there's less supply around the world.
Yes, you are right. There is less supply of it around the world, and therefore the suppliers of the intermediaries who supply us with gas to the home, they have to purchase their energy, be it gas or whatnot, wholesale from the producer, and their costs are increasing because there's been a heavy demand on gas for several reasons. Like we've had a mild winter, which is bad for renewable energy. There's a lot of competition for coal at the same time, and other such things. But and the intermediaries would necessarily have to raise their costs and pass a good bulk of it onto the consumer. That's not always possible because of government regulation. There's a price cap that protects the consumer from sharp rises of energy, and that has indeed caused several suppliers to shut down, to close their doors. But that is still a case of the suppliers of energy needing to pay more for something that's in high demand.
Yes.
So if somebody else were to come along,
that is due to a supply shortage rather than let's say an increase in money supply. So quantitative easing results in inflation because it devalues the currency.
Yes, that's right.
And
I don't disagree with you. I'm just saying that both cases, whether it's on the side of demand or on the side of supply, are both cases of too much money chasing too few goods. That's just a matter of definition, though.
Yeah, well, that's definitional, and we can disagree on the definition, but I think we both agree that it can be done due to demand, others factors due to supply.
Yes, correct.
And also,
I agree with that.
And also to the supply of money, which is another interesting we've just touched upon with regards to quantitative easing. Of course, there's been a hell of a lot of that globally during the pandemic, certainly after 2008 economic crash. That has led to huge quantities being held by the banks, been pumped into the economies, certainly in the West, but generally globally, I think it's fair to say.
Yes,
devaluing currencies and yes, and increasing very dramatically the cost of equities around the world. So we've seen massive increases in the price of shares, not necessarily due to anything that companies are doing specifically, although some companies have overperformed, but because you have these financial institutions who are buying a lot of equities because money is cheap.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, I think that's a good thing as far as the consumer is concerned. You take the US economy, I think, I do believe that the Federal Reserve of America is still pumping in $120 billion into the US economy per month to this day. Now, that would normally produce a huge effect on the price of goods because there's so much money in the economy. Shopkeepers can charge more for their products because everyone has more money in their hands. However, like you said just then, the money itself is not being sent directly to the consumer. Instead, the money is being sent to, or given or loaned to businesses, corporations who largely use it for stock buybacks, which has propped up the stock market. And that has produced a stock market bubble. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. First of all, much of the US economy does depend on the price of the stock market, including retirement incomes and so on. If that money weren't going to prop up that bubble, it would instead be circulating in the general consumer economy, where we'd see very sharp rises in prices. That's not to say that we aren't seeing price rises in the general economy in the US. I think it's about 5.2% now, the rate of inflation in the United States.
And in the US, it is 5.4 at the moment. That's right.
5.4, yes. So, well, that figure would be much higher had that money not been pumped into the stock market. So there is wisdom in putting money into the stock market, as much, even though the population by and large would say, well, it's a case of the Federal Reserve sorting out their friends and cronies, giving them free money.
Well, we've also had very low interest rates, which obviously favors borrowing, not so much savers, but favors borrowing, and that's used to stimulate the economy, in downturns.
Yes,
and obviously that translates also to cheaper mortgages, cheaper borrowing by small and large businesses to stimulate the economy, which has been necessary since 2008 and certainly during the pandemic. But we can also see from October 2020 until now, it's gone up from 1.2 to 5.4.
That's a vast increase.
That's a vast increase, and that's kind of translated across the board, really. 0.5 in the UK, 0.7 October 2020 to 3.2 now.
Shocking.
The Euro area from minus 0.3, so they had deflation there, to 3.4 now, which is yes, and I think that trend is going to continue. we haven't seen the increase in energy bills translate into inflation yet. And I think we're going to start seeing that coming through quite strongly. And also in production, which means the cost of goods on the high street will also increase as a result of that. And so I think inflation is going to be, rather than the transitory inflation that some have been talking of, Yellen here, talking of transitory inflation. I believe even the Bank of England, Bailey, was talking about that they don't see necessarily that the inflation was going to disappear anytime soon.
Yes,
but he
yes.
didn't think that it was going to be here for a long time. But again, I'm not so sure about that.
Well, there are noises coming out of the United States government, Federal Reserve type people who are saying that they cannot see how inflation can be transitory. It's going to be a more or less permanent feature moving forward. But even then, when they said originally that it was transitory, they later clarified their statement by saying that by transitory, they didn't mean that the inflation would revert back to what it was. They meant that the inflation rate would increase, but then not increase any further, as in the increase in inflation would be
as
transitory.
a slower growth rather than the fall in the number of the inflation. So going from
That's right.
5 to 6% instead of dropping down back to 2%.
That's correct. Yes. So there was a bit of word trickery there, because people were initially led to believe that the inflation rate would climb back down to pre-pandemic levels, but that's not proving to be the case. And now they're abandoning that notion altogether. The word transitory is now considered a swear word. There's one. I know it literally is considered a swear word. There was a government official in the United States, can't remember their name, but they now have a swear jar with the word transitory written on it. And anybody who mentions the word transitory has to put a dollar in the swear jar.
Interesting.
Because it's not going to be the case. It is a worrying thing, because the only in the last 10 to 20 years, take, for example, house prices, they've gone up considerably across most of the developed world.
Yes.
Doubled, tripled, and even quadrupled in value in some places, which means that the only way people could afford to take out a mortgage is if the inflation rate was very, very low, which it has been. Now, with these rate rises, it remains to be seen what effect that will have on in the world of housing.
Yeah, of course. What I've got here showing my screen of the inflation rate of 2% target for the Bank of England. I believe it's the same thing for the Federal Reserve in the United States. They do try to hit this 2% target. So what you're saying is we're not going to see 2% again.
I don't see how we can. There is. I mean, how is inflation calculated anyway? Generally, countries, certainly in the UK, the inflation rate is based on something called the Consumer Prices Index, or CPI.
Yeah, that's right.
And the CPI is based on the price rises of a quote unquote basket of goods.
That's right.
So they would take items which are currently relevant today, for example, maybe the price of milk, or the cost of a car, or I don't think they include the cost of homes in it, but general consumer goods anyway. Maybe the cost of gas, for example. That's very relevant to what we've been talking about.
They do.
And then they would, I think they may weight those price increases and then come up with a figure, which is kind of a general averaged measure of the increase in prices in the UK. So currently that's 3.2%, which means that this time next year, the money that you have will buy you 3.2% less of whatever it is that you want.
That's right.
So
where I want to take the conversation is, obviously inflation is something that affects everybody, but high inflation is not necessarily a bad thing if your wages, your salaries increase in line with that. So are we seeing wage inflation at this time or not? Obviously, there's a shortage of labor. Certainly in the West, it seems, certainly in the UK, I know it's also the case in the United States. Will that lead to wage inflation? And will that wage inflation be sufficient to cover what is expected to be relatively higher inflation in the near future?
I believe that that question has been answered in some areas. I think in the United States, they're talking about a return of stagflation
Mhm.
at the moment, and that's a combined a neologism that is combined of the word stagnation and inflation. So it's a situation where we have inflation, in other words, a rise in prices. At the same time, we have a stagnation of wages, where the earnings are not keeping up with the cost of things.
Mhm.
So I do think, just from general observation, I do think we have a situation of stagflation at the moment. Although pay for some sectors of work may well be increasing. I think in the medical sector there may be increases. In the banking sector there are often increases. In the UK we have increases for jobs like truck driving, for example, because there's a big shortage of them.
Yes.
So although those are ad hoc increases, they're not increases intended to keep up with inflation. They're just increases brought in because there's a shortage of workers in a particular sector.
Sure, but stagflation is a slowing economic growth. But have we seen slower economic growth for the stagnation bit? We've seen a rebound really since the pandemic. The question is that rebound going to last?
Well, I'm not sure how much of a rebound we've actually seen.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, economies are picking up after emerging from the lockdowns of the pandemic, but they are nowhere near where they were pre-pandemic. So it's natural that if you remove a lockdown, that businesses will open up again and there will be some sort of rebound. But that doesn't mean that the economy is growing. It just means that it's growing compared to where it was at lockdown.
Okay, I've just brought this up. So this is saying Q1 2020, which I guess is when the pandemic hit. And then we saw a big drop. This is the United Kingdom, by the way, apologies. This is gross domestic chain volume, seasonally adjusted in millions of pounds. This is for the United Kingdom economy. And we can see GDP rising up until we hit the pandemic. Q1 drops dramatically by Q2 2020. And then we can see that there has been a V-shaped recovery, but it's not, we're really not back on, still onto the trend. If we extend the trend where it was going, we're still not back onto that line.
We're not there yet, although we are heading up. So we may get to where we were eventually, but at the moment, I don't see how it's going to happen. For one thing, we just have to ask ourselves, during the pandemic, have more businesses been created than businesses that have closed down and been lost?
I think there's been a massive closure of small to medium-sized businesses in the United Kingdom for sure. I saw one statistic, and this is months ago, that 17,000 small businesses had shut down over a very small period of time. And that is large. That's a large number.
Yes.
So yeah, and we can see it on the high street as well. The high street's been devastated.
Boarded up.
Yes, boarded up shops left, right, and center.
Yeah, that's just it. So even without digging too deep into the figures, just logically, it wouldn't seem possible that our economy could return to where it was pre-pandemic. There's too few businesses, or not as many as there were before. So I don't think it's going to go back in the near term. The economy is never going to rebound to where it was before. So if you include things like, take for example Amazon. Now Amazon has grown a lot during the pandemic because people did a lot of online shopping.
Yes.
So you might be able to say that as a whole globally, perhaps there's not, we may well recover quite quickly, but that's only because the big multinational or transnational corporations have increased their share of the global economy
Yes.
during the course of the pandemic, at the expense of the small to medium-sized businesses. So even if the economy does rebound, the landscape of the global corporate sector has forever been changed, or at least forever as far as the eye can see.
Yes.
Maybe in 10, 20 years, sure, things may be different again, but certainly in the near future, it's not going to be possible to recover to where we were before. And don't forget also that these large corporations who've, your Netflixes, your Amazons, and so on, who've benefited from the pandemic, these are very large global brands. It's questionable as to how much they would benefit their host countries financially with their, creative tax situations where they can get away with not paying as much tax as perhaps they should do. So their income increase doesn't necessarily translate into tax takings by the governments of our world.
We're just looking at the figures here for Q1, Q2, United States, 6.3, 6.7, which is healthy. But yeah, no guarantee that's going to continue. And from what you were saying, it seems to be concentrated in larger companies at the expense of the smaller companies. And we don't necessarily know whether wage inflation is going to be a thing, whether the current record number of national vacancies is going to continue, and whether that's going to lead to wage inflation or not. That's going to keep up with inflation in the economy. So our guess is it's probably going to end up hitting people hard in the pocket in the upcoming years, and that might even be a permanent feature. Not permanent feature, but certainly into the medium term, 5-10 years.
Yes, I agree with that. And there are other macro factors that would that could be looming in the future, which could hit the consumer very, very hard. Like we touched on at the beginning of this show, there is a large amount of money being pumped into the economy all the time, every single month. And that money is finding its way into certain places, like, for example, the stock market, where we have a stock market bubble. Mm-hmm. Eventually, that money may well enter the general circulation. Once that stock market bubble pops, that money's got to go somewhere.
Yes.
And when you consider the sheer volume of money that is sitting there in the stock market, once that enters general circulation, I do believe we will see quite some horrendous inflation.
Yeah, so you're talking about money velocity. So money velocity increases as people spend more, especially when they've got higher inflation, because they want to spend the money today because tomorrow it's worth less. So it ends up being a circular loop where people are receiving more money from the government, and they're spending it more because inflation is there, which causes more inflation.
Yes.
And then then if you have runaway inflation or hyperinflation, as it's called, then that could be is very deleterious, very damaging to the economy.
Yes, that's right. There are certain. We'll talk about the US because it is the biggest economy in the world still. Only just. I think it's might be about to be pipped by China. Maybe it has been already. But the United States currency essentially holds its value regardless of the amount that's being printed, simply because the United States dollar is the world's reserve currency. Mm-hmm. Being a reserve currency means that everyone wants to hold dollars because you can buy nearly anything with it. You take big international trades like in the oil trade or the gas trade. Most of that is conducted in dollars. That means the dollar is always in demand, and therefore, no matter how much money the United States Federal Reserve creates, there will still be a demand for dollars, and that keeps the price of the dollar from inflating too much. Sorry, it keeps inflation at bay. It keeps the price of the dollar from going down, rather.
Yes,
So
but that only persists if the dollar remains the reserve currency.
that's right. That's right. And there are already noises from various parts of the world trying to de-dollarize and looking for other currencies to as payment for goods. I think already Russia and China have a bilateral trade in natural gas that's conducted in rubles and the yuan, Chinese yuan.
Yes.
And
Weren't
there's
weren't the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Russians trying to sort something, bypass the switch system or something to that effect? I read a few months ago.
yes, I do think there is an alternative to the SWIFT mechanism. You mean?
Yeah. Oh, what did I say?
A switch, I think.
Oh, SWIFT. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, SWIFT. So that's a mechanism for settling international payments
Yes.
between countries, and the BRICS countries, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and
South Africa.
South Africa, I believe they are also developing or may have already developed an alternative. Certainly, Russia has developed an alternative for internal payments, in which they're trying to encourage countries outside of Russia to also adopt. And the reason countries are doing this is because in recent years, the United States has been using SWIFT as a political weapon to target countries it doesn't like. It has done it with Iran, for example, where it's cut Iran out of the SWIFT system. It's made it very difficult for Iran to settle payments for imports without the SWIFT system. Certain countries like the EU have tried to find ways around it. But as soon as they find a way, the United States will also find a way to shut that down.
Yes, of course.
Through via sanctions on countries that try to evade the United States restrictions on countries that they don't like.
Okay.
So yes, there are the status of the United States dollar as the reserve currency is under threat, and when that does happen, of course, it will have a huge effect on the U.S. economy, because the U.S. economy is a consumer economy now. It's import driven. It's not such a big exporter as it used to be, and therefore, once the dollar loses value, the cost of imports will be enormous compared to what they used to be, and that will be the inflation that we will see in the United States.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Two Bold Chaps. If you have any thoughts on what you heard today, feel free to share them with us in the comments section. And if you enjoyed the content, please like, share and subscribe. And we'll see you in a week's time for the next episode. Bye for now.